A single stroke of a pen. That's all it took to legally wipe an entire bloodline off the face of the earth. Look closely at this official state document. It clearly states your great-grandfather was black. But look at this census record taken just 10 years earlier. It explicitly lists him as native. One of them is a lie. And I promise you, this was not a typo. This was not a careless clerical error. It was the calculated murder of a family's identity, executed from behind a wooden desk. Millions of Americans today are hitting impenetrable brick walls in their genealogy. They have rich oral histories of indigenous or multiracial ancestors, only to pull up the paperwork and find a completely different reality dictated by the state. Imagine the profound psychological whiplash. Imagine discovering that the government legally severed your roots, deciding that your traditions, your heritage, and the very blood in your veins technically did not exist. This is the brutal reality of paper genocide. We inherently trust archives and birth certificates to be impartial arbiters of truth. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, state officials, men wielding absolute unchecked power, weaponized the bureaucracy. They didn't need to fire a single bullet to destroy a community. They simply reclassified them out of existence to strip them of land, rights, and history. The terrifying truth is that the evidence of this massive systemic fraud is likely hiding in your own family tree right now. To understand how the system pulled off the greatest identity theft in American history, we have to look at the paperwork they tried to bury. To understand the sheer scale and cruelty of the reclassification trap, we have to look at the machinery of the state in the early 20th century. By 1924, the Virginia General Assembly passed the Racial Integrity Act. On the surface, it sounded like cold, clinical bureaucracy. In reality, it was a weapon of mass erasure. The law strictly mandated that every single person in the state be classified into one and only two categories, white or colored. There was no in-between. And crucially, for the thriving Native American tribes of the region, Indian was simply no longer an acceptable legal identity. Imagine the sheer psychological warfare of this moment. Picture being a mother in 1925, walking into a local vital statistics office to register the birth of your child. You belong to the Powhatan or Monacan tribes, peoples who have lived, bled, and survived on that exact soil for centuries. But the clerk at the desk looks at your skin, looks at his state-mandated guidelines, and stamps "colored" on your baby's birth certificate. If you argued, if you claimed your true indigenous heritage, you faced up to a year in state prison. You were legally, forcefully coerced into accepting a false identity. Families were thrown into an agonizing existential crisis. How do you pass down your culture when the very government that issues your identification legally insists your people are extinct? At the center of this bureaucratic nightmare was Walter Plecker, a physician, strict eugenicist, and the head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics for over 3 decades. Plecker was a man obsessed with racial purity. He harbored a paranoid belief that Native Americans in the state were actually black citizens, secretly trying to pass as indigenous to escape the brutal, crushing weight of Jim Crow laws. So he took it upon himself to correct reality. Plecker compiled what practically functioned as a hit list, a meticulously researched registry of family surnames associated with local Native tribes. He mailed out terrifying official threats to local clerks, hospitals, and midwives across the state. His orders were absolute: hunt down these specific families and alter their documents. If your last name was on Plecker's list, your history was retroactively rewritten without your consent. You could be born Native, but you would die black on paper. And because the U.S. Census heavily relied on these local vital statistics, this localized fraud acted like a virus, poisoning the national federal records. Entire tribal lineages vanished from the census overnight, effectively severing their treaties, their federal recognition, and their ancestral land rights. This is the very definition of paper genocide.
Long before men like Walter Plecker weaponized the stroke of a pen, the reality of race, survival, and identity in the Americas was incredibly complex. It was never neatly divided into the rigid binary boxes of white and colored. To truly understand what was stolen by the paper trail, we have to look at what existed before the ledgers arrived. Deep in the treacherous swamps and impenetrable forests of the American South, a profound and largely untold alliance was forged. We have to talk about the Maroon Societies and the legendary Black Seminoles. For generations, enslaved Africans who managed to escape the brutal machinery of the plantation system didn't just flee north, thousands ran south. They sought refuge in the unforgiving wetlands, territories aggressively defended by indigenous tribes who were also fighting displacement. These weren't just temporary hiding spots, they grew into heavily fortified, self-sustaining Maroon communities. In Florida, this blending of cultures created an unstoppable force. Escaped Africans and indigenous Seminoles intermarried, shared vital agricultural knowledge, and fought shoulder to shoulder. They shared a common enemy and a common struggle for absolute freedom. Imagine the rich, vibrant cultural tapestry of these villages, African polyrhythms seamlessly blending with indigenous ceremonial songs, a brand new language evolving in the swamplands. They were fiercely, undeniably Afro-indigenous. Their bond was so formidable that during the Second Seminole War, U.S. Major General Thomas Jessup famously warned the government that this was a Negro, not an Indian war. Black Seminoles were some of the fiercest commanders, leading guerrilla campaigns that brought the American military to a grinding halt. But how do you translate that profound, lived reality onto a rigid government census form? You don't. And that is where the tragedy of the paper trail deepens. When government agents and census takers finally documented these populations, they brought their binary worldview with them. To the state, a person could not be both. If you had dark skin and African features, agents simply checked the box for black, entirely erasing your indigenous lived experience, your spoken language, and your ancestral ties.
The paperwork couldn't comprehend intersectionality, so it chose erasure. By forcing these complex, powerful communities into a single, diminished category, the paper trail successfully dismantled what the military struggled to defeat. While the southern swamplands hid the complex reality of Afro-Indigenous alliances, the federal government was busy constructing a legal machine to systematically dismantle indigenous identity nationwide. If you couldn't beat them on the battlefield, you erased them on paper. This brings us to the Dawes Act of 1887, a piece of legislation so devastating it fundamentally fractured the concept of Native American ancestry forever. The Dawes Act was designed to strip tribes of their communal lands, chopping up millions of acres into individual, privately owned parcels. But to get a parcel, you had to prove to a federal commission that you were legally Indian. This is where the paper trail becomes weaponized on a federal scale. The government introduced an insidious, pseudo-scientific concept called blood quantum. Instead of recognizing cultural belonging, community ties, or lived experience, federal clerks began measuring humanity in crude, cold fractions. Imagine the sheer psychological degradation. Families who had survived, prayed, and bled together for centuries were lined up outside government tents, waiting for an appointed white clerk to arbitrarily inspect their physical features and assign a fraction to their soul. If the clerk decided your skin was too dark, or if your hair texture looked too African, you were instantly reclassified. Thousands of legitimate Afro-Indigenous people were bluntly labeled as freedmen or colored, completely severed from their rightful land allotments and their legal tribal lineage. But the corruption didn't stop at erasure, it bred outright theft. This era birthed the infuriating phenomenon of the $5 Indians. White opportunists quickly realized that getting onto the Dawes rolls meant securing lucrative, resource-rich land. So they simply bought their way in.
For a mere $5 slipped under a bureaucratic table, corrupt commission clerks would forge the paperwork, legally declaring a white settler as Native American. Think about the crushing generational injustice of this exact moment. While true Native and Afro-Indigenous families were being systematically erased from the records, disqualified by racist clerks and arbitrary fractional charts, white men were literally purchasing an indigenous identity. Today, millions of modern Americans have rich oral histories that trace back to indigenous ancestors, yet their paper trail is a dead end. Meanwhile, there are families holding on to land and federal recognition simply because their great-grandfather had 5 spare dollars in 1895. The system wasn't broken, it worked exactly as it was designed to. For over a century, the government's paper trail held an absolute, terrifying monopoly on the truth. The heavily guarded ledgers, the manipulated census forms, and the weaponized vital statistics were treated as the final, unquestionable word on who you were and where you came from. The systemic erasure orchestrated by men like Walter
Plecker and the corrupt clerks of the Dawes rolls successfully buried the identities of millions of Afro-Indigenous and Native Americans under mountains of bureaucratic red tape. But the paper trail had one fatal, insurmountable flaw. It could rewrite a birth certificate, but it could never rewrite the blood. Today, we are witnessing a massive, unprecedented reclamation of history, and it is entirely bypassing the state's bureaucracy. Millions of Americans are turning to commercial DNA testing to answer the questions that their fractured family trees simply couldn't. Imagine the profound emotional whiplash of opening an app on your phone, expecting to see the standard genealogical breakdown you were strictly taught in school, only to discover a massive, undeniable percentage of indigenous DNA. Suddenly, the conflicting family legends, the whispered stories of a great-grandmother from a specific tribe, and the confusing, violently altered census records all violently snap into focus. The state lied, the paperwork lied, but the DNA does not. This technological revolution is dismantling paper genocide, one cheek swab at a time. Everyday people are finally able to connect the dots that the government actively spent decades trying to erase. It is a deeply personal, psychological vindication to realize that your ancestors weren't just passive victims of a cold, bureaucratic machine. They were fierce survivors who passed down their resilience, their culture, and their very genetic code against impossible state-sponsored odds. The ink on those fraudulent documents has faded. The corrupt clerks are long dead, but the descendants are still here, and they are finally uncovering the truth. The system tried to sever the roots, but the tree kept growing. Now the power to define who you are is finally out of the hands of the government and back where it belongs. What about you? Have you ever hit an impossible brick wall while researching your own genealogy? Have you taken a DNA test that completely contradicted the official paperwork passed down in your family? I want to hear your stories. Drop a comment below. Hit that subscribe button to join our community, and let's keep uncovering the history they tried to bury.